Soloing over chord changes can seem a daunting task, especially if the changes are frequent and unconventional. But we have to start somewhere. The key thing is to break it all down into the smallest practical steps possible. That's what I aim to help you do throughout this series of lessons. By the end of the series, you should have a clear process in your mind for soloing over any sequence of chords that may be thrown at you. Let's begin. In the context of soloing, we can identify two main types of chord change. The first is where a group of two or more chords all reside within the same scale system. In other words, there are certain chord sequences, and even entire progressions, that allow us to use the same root scale throughout. A typical example of this would be playing minor pentatonic over an entire 12-bar blues progression. For example, we could play E minor pentatonic over a blues progression in the key of E, remembering that the tonic, or one chord, always shares the same root as the parent scale. Another example would be playing the C major scale over a 1-4-5 progression in C major. In fact, the scale would work over any combination of these chords in a progression, even without that C major root chord. We can of course transpose this to different keys, such as D major. We'll look more specifically at chord scales another time. In both these examples, every chord used in the progression can be connected to one scale, often called the parent scale of the progression. The other type of chord progression may include a number of chords that cannot be connected to a single parent scale. This means each chord change introduces a new scale system. This example is most prominent in jazz music, in which musicians tend to connect each chord with its own scale rather than applying one parent scale to the entire progression. As you can probably guess, the second type is more difficult to negotiate than the first, as each chord change requires a change of scale, rather than simply being able to stay in one fixed scale formation throughout the entire sequence. It's important that we get to grips with the first type before tackling the second, just as we learn to walk before we can run. While scales provide us with the building blocks we need for a solo, it's important to think about individual note selection to give your solo a musical and expressive purpose. When a single scale can be used over several chords, or even the entire progression, it's easy to fall into the trap of simply wandering up and down the scale and relying on the scale to do all the work. By thinking more about note selection, we can build phrases that say a lot more. Let's start with a really simple exercise in C major. You can download backing tracks to accompany this lesson by clicking the link in the description. So here we have two chords, the 1 and 4 chords of C major. That's C major as our tonic or 1 chord and F major as our 4 chord. Because both these chords are part of the C major chord scale, we can use the C major scale over both chords. This diagram shows us the C major scale in its first position box pan for easy reference. If we just played up and down the C major scale in sequence, you can tell immediately that both chords sound natural under this scale. But as I mentioned before, we're trying to create something a bit more meaningful and expressive for a solo. To do this, we need to build phrases within the scale. Starting on that tonic C major chord, simply pick a tone from the scale that harmonizes with the chord. This could be one of the tones of the major triad, such as the root, third or fifth, or one of the less neutral tones, such as the 2nd, 6th or major 7th. So let's say I pick the major 3rd as the starting note. I'm just going to hold that through the C major chord right until it changes to F major. Once the chord changes, I'm going to pick a new note still within that same scale that harmonises nicely over the F major chord. Now, I've picked the 6th of C major there, but because we're playing that note over F major, it's actually the major 3rd of F major. I don't want to confuse you with too much information at the moment, so let's just forget about what the scale becomes when the chord changes away from that tonic C major chord. We know that the notes of C major are compatible with both these chords, and that's all that matters at this stage. Let your ears be the judge of your note selection. What we essentially have now are two notes, a starting note and what is often referred to as a landing note for our phrase. We can now start to build our phrase in between these two notes. Think of it like a path leading to that landing note. The landing note gives us a sense of purpose and direction, and will help put our phrase into a musical context, rather than as wandering aimlessly around the scale. The notes we play in between these starting and landing notes act more as passing tones, so there's less emphasis on them than the starting and landing notes, which tend to be drawn out more with vibratos, for example. I'm just going to play around with some different notes between the starting and landing notes we established to give us a simple 3-note phrase. Don't forget to also try your starting and landing notes an octave higher or lower. Sometimes just 3 notes will be enough for a phrase, especially as an opening for the solo, but your solo will likely be made up of many interconnected phrases, some containing dozens of notes, some containing just 2 or 3, depending on what you want to say. Of course, there are other things to think about, such as rhythm and timing, how you play the notes you select, etc. The more solos you listen to, the more you'll get an ear for different timings and techniques you can apply to these phrases, but it's not practical to cram everything into one lesson. Therefore, to stay focused, we're just going to play some larger phrases in straight 8th and 16th notes. With the metronome, that's 2 notes per click or 4 notes per click respectively. So, taking our starting and landing notes again, I'm just going to widen the scale pattern to give us more freedom, allowing us to incorporate techniques such as sliding. Try linking your F major landing note to a new C major landing note, using as many or as few notes as you want. In this example, I've chosen the major 7th. When we come back to C major, we can start a new phrase from that new landing note. Remember, this is not always about cramming as many notes as we can into the phrase. For example, I might choose to repeat the 2-note format of the opening phrase just from that new landing note. Or I might choose to fill out the phrase over C major a bit more as follows. You can also hold notes within the phrase to break it up. Make sure any note you do hold harmonizes with the backing chord, as some notes are best used purely as passing tones. Another way to break up your phrases is to simply stop a note, either by muting it dead or sliding out. Think of this muted break like a full stop at the end of a sentence. Keep trying different landing notes through each chord change, and experiment with phrases that use both a few notes and a dozen or so notes. Try repeating phrases and then changing them slightly. There are no rules, just go with what sounds right to you. The starting and landing notes you choose will help put your phrases into context and keep your overall solo sounding musical and purposeful rather than aimless. There's still a lot to cover, and in the next part we'll build on the process we've started here. Remember to grab your free backing tracks for this lesson by clicking the link in the description. Cheers.